Hi guys, today we're continuing on with the environmental sociological heading in industry study. We're looking at the dot point to start with pollution. Pollution is anything that industry produces which goes into the environment which has a negative impact. Anything that they produce that goes into the environment and impacts whether it's plants and wildlife or people or waterways, anything that goes out of the industry into those areas which has a negative effect can be counted as pollution. There are three main areas that we're looking at for pollution. There's noise pollution, effluent, and air. And it's important when answering industry study extended response questions on this that you know what these three pollutions are. So noise pollution is when some type of factory or some type of industry produces noise which is excessive. The impact of this is usually on human population. So an example would be a factory working in an industrial area with houses nearby. So areas are zoned depending on what type of buildings there are there. So like a residential area would be zoned for housing, and an industrial area would be zoned for like industrial use. Those areas have got different amounts of noise that are allowed to be produced at different times. And it's important for the industry or the company working to know what hours they're allowed to produce noise to and what decibel or what volume they're allowed to produce noise to. If they're found to be in breach of that, then they can be issued with fines. And if you've ever lived near any type of factory or any type of industry that produces large amounts of noise, you would know that it disrupts your sleep, and then that is technically an impact on the environment because us as humans are part of the environment. Effluent is any waste that is produced and goes into waterways. So whenever you flush the toilet, that is technically effluent because it's polluted water which goes and gets treated. So you would see a lot of industry, particularly along rivers like Parramatta River. There are a lot of factories which take water in, which they use in their processes, and then pump water out back into the river. There are rules and regulations, legislation around what is allowed to be pumped back into the waterway and what isn't, and processes for treating that. So any type of water that has some type of contamination in it is known as effluent. Air pollution is when obviously the contamination goes into the air. So if you're driving past a factory and you see a big stack and there's smoke coming out of the top, that's a form of air pollution. Obviously the hazards of air pollution is that us as humans, we breathe that air, so we don't want to be breathing that contamination. Again, there are rules and regulations and legislation around what type of chemicals and materials allowed to be pumped out into the air. And again, if the industry doesn't comply with those regulations, then they're likely to be fined or put out of business. The next dot point is sustainable development. Sustainability means anything that we can continue to do and regenerate. So something that is non-sustainable, like a non-sustainable resource, is something that is eventually going to run out. So sustainable development is where we build buildings and industry in a way that it's going to be able to continue to be used into the future, and that our resources are not going to be depleted. So there are ways that we can build buildings in particular which make them sustainable. So an example of that would be using sustainable electricity. So having some type of way to produce electricity which does not burn fossil fuels. Examples would be some type of solar panels on the roof or wind generators. There are lots of buildings around that have got their own little wind generator on the roof. Having those things built in to the property help it to be sustainable. But there are also some other things that they can do, like having grey water systems which recycle water so that water isn't being used up. in an inefficient way. Or it could be to do with the way that the building is facing or the orientation, so that it makes use of the sunlight to keep it warm, so that you're not having to heat the house or the building with air conditioning or some type of other heating. These are just some examples of things that builders or industry can put into their buildings to make them more sustainable. The next dot point is rehabilitation of commercial sites. So a commercial site that's been contaminated can be condemned. So maybe there's been a factory or some type of industry on a piece of land back in the day, or historically. There have been looser laws and legislations around what type of chemicals can be used or how they deal with waste. And a lot of time, the land where these older factories or industry has been totally contaminated and then condemned, so people can't use it anymore. The example that's here on this site is the Sydney Olympic Park at Homebush was a condemned site, so there was a whole lot of industry in there where they used some pretty heavy chemicals which leached into the ground, and no one could go in there and they couldn't use it for anything. So what they do is they rehab it, or rehabilitation of those sites. They go in, they clean it up, they take the chemicals out, and they replace it with other earth or other dirt and soil, and clean it up so that it can be reused again. If industry doesn't follow the rules and regulations, then they will pollute the sites, and then that makes it so that they can't use them anymore, and government or independent companies will have to rehabilitate the site to use it.